Julia stared at her phone, disbelief tightening in her chest. A message from her mother read, "We changed the locks. You don't have a home anymore." It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was war. Julia drove to 17 Mayfield Drive, the house her grandmother left her in a notarized will, only to find her key useless and her belongings stuffed in trash bags on the porch. The TMFA voice. Her father stood inside, watching through the curtain, saying nothing. With shaking hands, Julia texted her best friend Leah. "They kicked me out. I don't know what to do." Leah responded instantly, "On my way." This wasn't just about a house. It was about everything that house represented. Family, love, legacy, and her grandmother's last gift. Julia wasn't ready for revenge, not yet. But she wasn't going to disappear either. Not this time. Not ever again. Julia Hartman was 32 years old and had spent most of her adult life carving out a space for herself in Portland, Oregon. By day, she served as the communications director at a small but growing tech firm, where her calm under pressure and laser-sharp messaging had won her quiet respect in a male-dominated boardroom. She wasn't flashy or loud, but she was clear, consistent, and unshakably dependable. Outside of work, Julia kept to a small circle. Her best friend Leah, a local designer, and the home she had spent years restoring with her own hands. That house wasn't just wood and brick. It was history, memory, and the closest thing she had to safety. The house at 17 Mayfield Drive had belonged to her grandmother, Helen, a woman of gentle resilience and sharp wit, who had been more of a mother to Julia than Carol, her actual mom, ever managed to be. Julia had moved in just months after Helen passed away. She didn't throw out the past, she preserved it. She had the wiring updated, the roof repaired, and every room painted in tones her grandmother would have approved of. She kept the weathered windows, the original hardwood floors, and the three-legged tea table her grandmother refused to part with, even when it leaned slightly to one side. Every corner of that home held a memory. Sunday mornings filled with the scent of lavender and apple pie, quiet evenings folding laundry side by side, the radio humming in the background. That house wasn't just a home. It was Julia's emotional anchor. The legal right to the house was clear. Helen's notarized will left 17 Mayfield Drive to Julia exclusively, with specific language stating her reasons. Julia had always listened, respected the home's history, and showed care that others never bothered to give. When the lawyer read those words, Julia had felt a deep wave of responsibility, not just for the property, but would eventually accept it. She was wrong. Carol, Julia's mother, had always been controlling. From childhood, Julia had learned to swallow her instincts and silence her voice to avoid conflict. Everything had to be done Carol's way. From how the Christmas tree was decorated, to what college Julia applied to. Her father, Dennis, was less combative, but no less complicit. He usually stayed quiet and let Carol lead. Julia had long since grown used to the subtle war for autonomy in their household, and she'd thought maybe adulthood would shift the power dynamic. But instead, it had only grown more bitter. They didn't see Helen's bequest as a tribute, they saw it as betrayal. Carol, in particular, viewed Julia's inheritance as theft of status, control, and money. She had expected that house to be divided or sold, with the profits shared. But that wasn't what Helen wanted. And Julia had no intention of going against her grandmother's wishes. She invited her parents for dinner, tried to keep the peace, and never threw their resentment back in their faces. But the tension was there. Cold glances, passive-aggressive comments, and long silences that filled the hallways like smoke. Still, Julia held on. She had her home, she had her grandmother's letter, and she had her sense of purpose. Until the morning she received that text. "We changed the locks. You don't have a home anymore." Suddenly, everything Helen had left her, every memory, every room, every right, was under attack. And Julia realized this wasn't just grief or disappointment. It was a hostile takeover. The day of the will reading felt more like a funeral than the funeral itself. Julia sat in the law office across from her parents, Carol and Dennis, and her younger brother, Ryan. The air was thick with unspoken expectation. Julia didn't think there would be surprises. She already knew Helen had left her the house, having told her so gently in the hospital, days before passing. Still, hearing the lawyer say it aloud, the property at 17 Mayfield Drive, along with its contents, is left in full to my granddaughter, Julia Hartman, sent a ripple through the room. Carol's expression hardened instantly. Her jaw clenched, her nostrils flared, but she said nothing. Dennis looked stunned, blinking as though he had misheard. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, tapping his fingers against his knee, but stayed silent. Then the lawyer handed Julia a sealed envelope. Helen's handwriting. Inside was a letter, written in her grandmother's looping script, explaining the choice. "You saw this house as more than property," Helen had written. "You cared for its soul. That's why it's yours." Julia pressed the letter to her chest. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and thanked the attorney. She thought, maybe with time they would accept it. In the following weeks, Julia moved in. She painted the front door Helen's favorite color, sage green. She replaced the broken banister herself, sanded old furniture, even repotted her grandmother's beloved lilies. Every nail she drove into the wall felt like a promise kept. Her own savings paid for the repairs, didn't ask for help, didn't flaunt the inheritance. She texted updates. She tried to keep the door open. But her mother rarely responded. When she did, it was clipped, passive-aggressive. "I hope you're not making too many changes. Your grandmother wouldn't want modern furniture in that parlor." Her father followed suit, distant, then absent. Ryan was the only one who occasionally replied to her messages, usually with vague emojis or neutral thumbs-ups. Julia carried on. She focused on work, on the restoration, and on honoring Helen's legacy. Until the day she returned from a 3-day business trip in Seattle. It was raining when she pulled into the driveway. The porch light was off, which was odd. She stepped onto the stoop and reached for her key. It didn't fit. She tried again. Nothing. Confused, she checked the lock. It had been changed. Heart racing, she knocked. No one answered. She circled around to the back, same story. Then she spotted them, black trash bags lined up neatly along the side of the house. Her sweaters, her shoes, her photo albums, tossed together with boxes of books and kitchenware. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. There it was. A text from her mother. "Don't cause trouble. It's for the good of the family." Julia stood there for several minutes, soaked and frozen. Not just from the rain, but from the realization. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Her parents had locked her out of her own home, her inheritance, her sanctuary. And now, it wasn't just about the house. It was war. Julia stood in the rain, her hands gripping the trash bags that held the pieces of her life. She called her mother, straight to voicemail. She tried her father. Nothing. She texted Ryan, just one word, "Why?" He read the message, but didn't respond. Her chest tightened. She wasn't just locked out. She was erased. Inside those bags, everything felt tainted. But what made her stomach drop was what wasn't there. The legal documents from Helen's will, the title deed, Helen's jewelry box, and most painfully, a small USB drive that held a recording Helen had made weeks before her death. Julia hadn't even listened to it yet. She'd saved it for a quiet evening, thinking it would be comforting. Now it was gone. Leah didn't let her spiral. She pulled up in her beat-up Corolla, wrapped Julia in a blanket, and drove her home. "You're staying with me," she said. "Tomorrow, we get a lawyer. This isn't over." By 9 a.m., they were sitting in a downtown office across from Amber Doyle, a sharp-tongued real estate attorney known for her tenacity. After reviewing the documents, Julia still hadn't copies of the will, renovation receipts, and texts from Helen. Amber leaned back and said, "Your parents committed an illegal eviction, and if they removed that USB drive, that could be tampering with a testamentary gift." They filed an emergency injunction with the court. Within 48 hours, Julia would be legally back in her home, at least temporarily, pending further proceedings. But just when Julia thought things couldn't get messier, a police officer showed up at Leah's apartment with a report. Her parents had accused her of stealing valuable property and sentimental items from the Mayfield house. Julia's heart sank. They were trying to flip the narrative, to paint her as the unstable, greedy granddaughter who had manipulated a dying woman. It wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Amber was furious but unsurprised. This is a scare tactic. They want you to back off and settle. Don't. We fight. That night, as Julia sat curled up on Leah's couch, feeling the weight of betrayal press into every inch of her skin, a new email notification pinged. The sender's name stopped her cold. Margaret Holden. The subject line read, "Something your grandmother left for you." Julia opened it, her heart pounding. Margaret introduced herself as Helen's half-sister, someone Julia had only heard mentioned in passing, an older woman who lived in Washington state. The email was short but powerful. "Helen asked me to hold on to a few things, in case the family turns on her," she said. "I always hoped I wouldn't have to send them, but I believe this is the time. Call me." Attached was a photo of Helen, smiling warmly, sitting beside Margaret with a sealed manila envelope in her lap. Julia stared at the image, tears in her eyes. Her grandmother had known. She'd seen this coming, and even from the grave, she was still protecting her. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Julia drove through the pine-lined roads of Ashwood, Oregon, her grip on the steering wheel tight. She hadn't slept much since the eviction, and the weight of the past few days settled like a stone in her chest. But as the small farmhouse came into view, something shifted. Aunt Margaret stood on the porch, waving gently, a worn envelope in her hand. Inside, over a pot of strong tea, Margaret handed her the envelope and the small black USB drive. "Your grandmother gave me these months before she passed," she said softly. "She said if anything ever happened to your access to the house, or if the family turned against you, I was to make sure you got this. Helen didn't trust many people in her final years, but she trusted you." Julia opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a letter in Helen's graceful cursive. "Dearest Julia," it began. "If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. I tried to believe they would respect my wishes, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't. Your mother and father pressured me for years to sell the Mayfield home. When I refused, they threatened to place me in a care facility and take control of my finances. That's why I changed my will. That's why I documented everything." Julia's hands trembled as she read. Helen had even written down dates and descriptions of arguments, instances when Carol had screamed about being owed that house, and Dennis had called Helen senile in front of neighbors. Margaret gestured to the USB. "There's more." Julia plugged it into her laptop. The first file was Helen, speaking directly to the camera. "My name is Helen May Hartman. I am of sound mind, fully aware of my decisions. I leave the Mayfield house to my granddaughter, Julia Hartman, because she cherishes it. I do not leave it to my daughter Carol or her husband Dennis due to repeated emotional manipulation and attempts to remove me from my home." The next file was audio again, recorded on Margaret's phone, apparently during one of Helen's visits to Ashwood. Julia's blood ran cold. "Carol, just sign the papers already, Mom. You're not even using the upstairs. Dennis, you won't even know the difference. We'll get you a nice place with nurses. Why does Julia need that house? She's just playing house with ghosts." Helen's voice was defiant. "Get out of my sister's home. Now." Julia closed the laptop, her eyes burning. Margaret placed a hand over hers. She was scared of them, but she wasn't scared for herself. She was scared for you. She knew they'd come after you next. She wanted you to have the truth. Back in Portland, Julia rushed straight to Amber's office. The attorney listened in silence as Julia played the files. Her face remained unreadable until the end of Helen's video. Then she sat back and said, "We now have more than a will. We have documented intent and evidence of coercion. This changes everything." That afternoon, Amber filed new charges: fraud, illegal eviction, destruction of personal property, and emotional distress. She also filed a petition to have the house restored immediately to Julia's possession, with added damages for harassment. Julia's parents weren't just wrong, they were about to be legally exposed. Julia sat outside the courthouse steps, watching the sun filter through the trees. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to steady. Her grandmother had left her more than a home. She'd left her a legacy of truth. And now, Julia would finish what Helen started. Julia stood just outside the courtroom, taking in one last steady breath. She could hear her heels echo softly against the marble as she entered, her attorney Amber Doyle at her side. Across the aisle sat her parents, Carol and Dennis Hartman. Her mother wore a gray blazer, her face cold and unreadable. Her father's jaw clenched with barely restrained contempt. Beside them, their attorney shuffled papers, trying to look confident. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Honorable Judge Avery, called the hearing to order. The emergency injunction had already granted Julia temporary access to the home, but this hearing would determine ownership, damages, and possible penalties. Her parents' attorney stood and claimed that Helen Hartman, Julia's grandmother, had not been of sound mind when she wrote her will. That the documents were coerced, that Julia manipulated her. Amber remained quiet until the judge asked for their evidence. Without a word, Amber placed a USB on the table and handed the judge a certified transcript. She asked for permission to play the recording. The judge granted it. The courtroom speakers crackled to life. Helen's voice, clear and firm, filled the air. "My name is Helen May Hartman. I am of sound mind. I leave my home to my granddaughter Julia Hartman because she understands its worth, not just in money, but in meaning. I do not trust my daughter or her husband with my legacy. They pressured me, insulted me, tried to take control of my life. I have chosen peace, and I choose Julia." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Then the second file played. The room went silent. Carol's voice. "Just sign the papers already, Mom. You're too old to manage a house." Dennis. "You think Julia's going to take care of you? She barely visits." Helen. "Get out. You're not welcome here." The judge leaned forward. "How recent is this?" Amber answered, 10 months before Helen passed. She recorded it with the help of her sister Margaret Holden, who was present. The judge asked if Margaret was available for verification. Margaret stood from the back of the room, calm and steady. She was sworn in and confirmed every detail. She also provided timestamps and her own affidavit. Carol visibly paled. Dennis sat back in his chair, arms crossed. Julia sat still, not gloating, not even glancing their way, her hands folded neatly in her lap. This wasn't about them anymore. The judge closed the file and looked directly at her parents. "The court finds that Helen Hartman was indeed of sound mind and documented her wishes clearly. The actions taken by Mr. and Mrs. Hartman constitute unlawful eviction, tampering with inheritance, and emotional distress." She turned to Julia. "The property at 17 Mayfield Drive is yours. Full ownership, immediate restoration. Any possessions removed must be returned or replaced. Additionally, Mr. and Mrs. Hartman are ordered to pay damages of $82,000, 0 cents for property loss, legal fees, and emotional harm." Carol let out a small gasp. The judge continued, "You are also ordered to stay a minimum of 200 feet from the property at all times. Any further interference will result in criminal charges." Dennis shot to his feet. "This is a setup. She poisoned her. She turned my mother-in-law against us." The bailiff moved forward. The judge raised her hand. "Mr. Hartman, one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." Dennis fell silent, trembling with rage. Carol didn't move. Her head hung low, her hands clenched in her lap. For once, she had no words. Julia stood when the hearing adjourned. Reporters had gathered just outside the courtroom. She ignored them. She had nothing to say. Not today. Amber squeezed her shoulder. We did it. Julia nodded once. She didn't smile. This wasn't a victory march. This wasn't revenge. This was her grandmother's voice being heard, her own life being restored. Justice wasn't loud. It was calm, clear, and undeniable. And now it belonged to her. Julia stood in front of the house at 17 Mayfield Drive, the keys warm in her palm. The front yard was overgrown, the porch dusty and splintered, but it was hers again, legally, emotionally, spiritually. As she stepped inside, the air felt heavy with dust and memory. Her grandmother's scent was gone, replaced by the bitter staleness of absence. The furniture had been rearranged, some pieces missing. Boxes of junk had replaced family keepsakes. It wasn't a home anymore. But it would be. Leah arrived that afternoon with coffee, work gloves, and a team of friends who brought paint, power tools, and music. Together they began the slow, aching work of restoration. Julia didn't try to recreate the exact past. She focused on what mattered. She found the carved tea table her grandmother used to host book club meetings and refinished it with care. She uncovered the brass pendulum of Helen's clock, buried beneath a pile of tangled cords, and restored its gentle ticking. Every item salvaged felt like reclaiming a memory. The process took weeks, then months. Julia worked her full-time job by day and scrubbed walls by night. Her therapist encouraged her to make the space a reflection of healing. That gave her an idea. She transformed the old dining room, the one where holiday tensions once simmered, into a small gallery. White walls, soft lighting, and local artwork with themes of family, distance, grief, and resilience. She named it the Hartman Room. It was a tribute not just to her grandmother, but to the journey of reclaiming what was nearly stolen. Word spread in Portland's creative community. Her first exhibition, Fractures and Foundations, drew a strong turnout. People wandered through, quietly absorbing the pieces and reading placards that included short stories about memory, miscommunication, and inheritance. Julia watched from the corner, unsure how to feel, until she saw someone unexpected. Ryan. He stood awkwardly at the doorway before stepping inside, holding something in his hands. When he reached her, he offered a small frame. Inside it was an old photo. Helen and Julia, sitting on the front porch, sharing a laugh over iced tea. Julia remembered that day, the sun, the simplicity. I thought this belonged here, Ryan said. Julia didn't speak at first. Ryan cleared his throat. I'm sorry for not saying anything. I was scared, but that doesn't excuse it. You deserved better. She nodded slowly. Thank you. She didn't say, I forgive you, because forgiveness wasn't a prize to hand out like a ribbon, but acknowledgement was powerful, and sometimes it was enough. They placed the photo near the tea table. Julia watched strangers admire it and smile. She stood taller, not because she had won a battle, but because she had rebuilt something far more meaningful. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth, about space, about voice. Julia had reclaimed more than her house. She had reclaimed her narrative, her legacy, and her peace. And with every visitor who stepped into the Hartman Room, her grandmother's spirit lived on, in art, in memory, and in quiet, unwavering strength. Life at 17 Mayfield Drive gradually settled into something Julia hadn't felt in years. Peace. The rhythm was simple but deeply satisfying. She still worked as communications director at the tech firm, crafting campaigns and mentoring junior staff, but the heart of her world pulsed inside the gallery she had built. The Hartman Room was no longer just a side project. It had become a sanctuary, not only for Julia, but for others in the community who longed to see stories of resilience and memory reflected in art. Locals brought their own pieces, Paintings of broken homes mended with gold leaf, sculptures shaped like family trees with snapped branches, poetry scrawled across canvas in layered script. Julia curated every exhibition with care, often adding handwritten notes from her own journals beside the artwork. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was showing up fully. Her parents never returned to the house. They didn't call. But every year, without fail, her mother sent a plain birthday card. No message inside. Just her name in hard-pressed cursive. Julia didn't throw them away. She kept them stacked in a drawer in her bedroom. Not because she hoped for reconciliation, but because they reminded her what it meant to hold a boundary. She no longer begged for love from those who gave it conditionally. Julia found deeper connection through her late-night phone calls with Aunt Margaret. They talked about Helen, her quiet acts of defiance, her sharp memory, her refusal to let others dictate her worth. How Helen once refused to sell her land even when pressured by city developers. How she once walked out of church when the pastor mocked single mothers. Helen had been gentle but never passive. She had been brave in ways Julia was only now beginning to understand. And with each new exhibition, Julia honored that bravery. At the end of every show, once the last guest had left and the gallery lights dimmed, Julia stood before the largest photograph on the gallery's back wall. It was her favorite. Helen in her garden, sleeves rolled, a smile playing across her lips as she looked directly into the camera. Julia would close her eyes, breathe in the scent of old wood and fresh paint, and whisper aloud, "You were right, I didn't back down." She didn't say it for drama. She said it because it anchored her. Because even now, years after her grandmother's passing, Helen's presence was still guiding her, through the ache, through the healing, through every small act of rebuilding. Julia hadn't just reclaimed a house, she had reclaimed her story, her roots, her strength. And in the quiet, in the light of art and memory, she finally felt what she'd been chasing for so long. Not just justice, not just peace, but a profound, unshakable sense of home. They changed the locks, thinking they could erase me from my own legacy. They thought a door could shut me out of my own bloodline. But what they didn't understand is that I wasn't just a girl with a key, I was the keeper of memory. I didn't inherit just a house. I inherited a truth, a lineage, and a woman's voice they tried to silence. They thought they could take everything, but I kept my dignity, my courage, and a deeper understanding of who I am. My name is Julia Hartman, and this isn't a story of property. It's a story of standing up for the ones who came before us, for the truths others try to bury, and for the power refusing to back down. If your family ever tried to rewrite your worth, if they made you feel like your voice didn't matter, fight for the truth. Stand for your story. Reclaim what is yours, not just in name, but in spirit. Because what we inherit isn't always land. Sometimes, it's the strength to say, "This ends with me." Subscribe to Veiled Fury for more stories of betrayal shattered and strength reclaimed. Because silence never protected us. But our truth? That's where the fury lives.